Welcome back to the leather shop. Today we're going to do a video on how to make holster patterns. I'm going to be using this blue gun to make the holster pattern with. You can also use a real firearm, but make sure it is unloaded. The things we're going to be using today, I've got cardboard. You can use any kind of cardboard, cereal box, whatever. Printer paper, a pencil, an eraser that I've got here somewhere, a pencil and eraser, a 6-inch ruler. You don't need a protractor, but I'm going to be using it, a utility knife, and masking tape. Let's get started. Alright, let's get started. So first of all, I've done a couple of things to save some time. I've got 3 sheets of paper here, taped together with masking tape. To trace the gun, you lay the gun directly in this crease. Okay, let's back up for a second. You want to take this and crease it in half. And that's how we'll make our holster pattern, because this will end up being the 2 sides of your holster. Take the gun and lay it with its sights exactly in the center of that crease, and then slowly roll it over. You want the gun to travel along the paper as if it was on a gear, and then trace around the gun. When you're tracing the gun, you're going to want to look perfectly vertical at it, because if you look to the side, you'll get a slanted angle and your tracing won't turn out right. To save time, I already traced the gun out. I like to leave somewhere between 3/4 to an inch around the gun to allow for the extra amount of leather to go around the gun. This one I'm going to be lining a 7 to 8 ounce leather holster with 4 to 5 ounce leather, and I'm going to be putting that steel liner in as many Hollywood rigs had, such as Clint Eastwood's Fistful of Dollars rig and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the Dollars trilogy. So I'm just kind of making a few marks here. Now once you get up around the trigger guard, because it gets a lot thinner up here than the rest of the gun, I like to go a little bit narrower. So I'll go down to 5/8 of an inch, somewhere around 11/16, 5/8, somewhere in there. So right there. Okay, so we've got a few dots here, and we're going to play dot to dot now. Now, some of this, you just want it to flow nicely. It's not necessarily a perfect follow the distance. You want it to flow nicely. And this curve that I just drew is critical. I'll explain that to you here. This curve, you could follow the barrel in a straight line like that. I don't like doing that, because when I draw the gun, I usually pull backwards. Now you can watch the barrel as it travels along this line. It'll flow along that curve nicely as you pull the gun out of the holster. If you make that line follow the barrel, you have to pull the gun straight out until you can start tipping it. I've made holsters like that before. I was not very happy with how they turned out, and so I'll share that piece of knowledge with you. The distance right here is also crucial, because this distance will keep your gun from falling into the holster farther or through. You want this to be right between that 3/4 of an inch to an inch, because this point will contact that as the gun is going into the holster. Now, if I was making this for an everyday carry holster, I would want to cover the trigger guard like that. This is going to be a fast draw holster, so I want the trigger exposed. As you can see, I found my eraser. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of turn in right there. You can see that my trigger is going to be nicely exposed there. And this line, I'm just kind of eyeballing in what looks good. Now, if you're not comfortable just drawing arcs, there are a few tricks you can use. You can take your roll of masking tape and you can squeeze it into different oblong shapes, and that works well. And for making corners like this, you can also use a coin. Just trace around a coin, makes a nice circle, and you can follow that line. I'm pretty happy with how that looks, although just looking at it, to me it seems like it's going to be a little bit tight down here. So I'm just going to extend that a little bit. Because I'm using a leather that's fairly thick to start with, and then lining it with both leather and steel, I want to leave plenty of room for my gun to fit. Alright, I'm pretty happy with how that looks. So we'll move on to the rest of the holster. I'm going to set that aside and get my cutting board out, which I forgot to mention in the beginning of this video. This is a poundo board. You can use any kind of cutting board. And utility knife. You could use a scissors for this. I don't, simply because I have my utility knife handy and I have my cutting board handy, and you're going to need both of those when you cut the leather out for the holster, because the leather that we use for the holster is too thick to cut easily with the scissors. Just kind of follow those pencil lines. None of this is rocket science, and you will make some holsters that don't fit, and you will make some holsters that turn out very well. But the only way you're going to make a good holster is to try. And sure, you might mess up, or it might turn out real well. Now what I'm doing is I'm tracing around the outside here so that we get both sides of our holster. You can do this a couple of different ways. You can trace it like I'm doing, or before you cut out the first side, you just simply fold the paper in half and cut out both sides at once. Now here, this is going to get important here to not cut out this section, because that is where our belt loop is going to come into play. Now if you saw a moment ago, this doesn't quite line up together, so I'm just going to trim that little bit off. It was just a feather, but it bothered me. Get rid of this excess paper. Now I want this holster to have a 15-degree or so forward cant. I'm going to flip this over so that we're looking at it as if it was a right-handed holster. I'm right-handed, and so that's the style of holster I'll be making. This line is straight with the center of our holster. So this is 0 degrees. That's 10 degrees. That would be 15 degrees. I don't quite want it tipped forward that much. I'm going to go right about 12 degrees right there. And I just drove off between my granite stones here. I just want that line to flow nicely. And then bring this one up to about there. Now I'll grab my ruler. That's 3 3/4 roughly. That'll work. If you get too wide, then it gets too stiff. If you get too narrow, no, that's 2 3/4. Okay, that's about perfect. If you get too narrow, then it gets floppy. So there's a fine line. My gun belts are a 2.5-inch gun belt. And I found that if you have your holster belt loop somewhere around that same size, that 2.5-ish, it works quite well. Now I'm going to pick the center line where this is going to fold. I'm going to be doing this on my straight gun belt, and I want the holster to drop down a fair bit. I want the top of the holster to be just below the gun belt. And again, my gun belt is 2.5 inches wide. So I think I'm going to do about 3.5 inches. So right there. Now I just take and square this off. I'm going to use my protractor since it's handy and go 90 degrees with this. Let's see, I can go 15 degrees off of this line too. That way we'll, or I should say that 12 degrees that I wanted. And that'll give me my fold line. We might go 12.5. A lot of this is just kind of arbitrary, make it up as you go. There's no perfect science to holster making. I'll just fold it right on that pencil line. And now I'm going to cut this out. Just going to follow this line right through the holster here. And you'll see how that plays out in a moment. And then we'll follow this line down here. Right to there. Now I'm just going to remove this excess paper. So that I don't have to look at it. Now I'm going to draw the skirt around the holster. I want a simple skirt that's reminiscent of what they used, the holsters they use in Bonanza, the Big Valley, and somewhatly similar to Clint Eastwood's Dollars Trilogy rig that he wears in the 3 movies that go with The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So I don't want a lot of flare around this holster. I just want a little bit of a skirt. Just enough to know that it's there. Then up here, I'm just going to, now here I'll show you how you can use a coin. I was just going to draw that in, but just use a coin, put it in that corner, trace around it. Presto, you have a nice curve, easy to follow. Zip right around. Like I said before, you could use the scissors for this. I just don't. I find it easier to make nice flowing lines with a knife. That's just me. So I've already got my cardboard prepped for sake of time. I've taken, just like the sheets of paper, and taped 3 8.5 by 11 pieces of cardboard together. You can just use this piece of paper and make your holster pattern, trace your holster out around it, but it is a lot easier if you glue the paper down to the cardboard. You want to make sure and get the edges glued nicely. The middle's not as critical. You want to get it all glued down well, but the edges are the critical part. If they're flopping up on you, it makes a tacky and difficult to use pattern. Since I'm right-handed, and I usually end up making right-handed holsters, I like to put the paper on to where it would be a right-handed holster with the paper facing up. That helps prevent accidentally cutting out the wrong hand of holster. It does happen. I have done it. You will make mistakes, but that's how you learn. Put the cap back on that. Now we're going to flip this over. And that's just regular old glue stick, nothing special. I'm just going to smooth this out onto our cardboard. You want to be careful not to wrinkle your paper as you're doing this, because that'll skew your holster pattern. If you get a big crease in here, it'll make it too small. That's as simple as that. Now I'm just going to take, usually I wait for the glue to dry out well, but for the sake of this video, I'm just going to cut this out right away. Again, it works better to wait till the glue dries. But I just take the utility knife and cut right along the paper. You don't want to cut the paper. If you get into it a little bit, it's not the end of the world. This isn't rocket science, this is a holster. But you don't want to alter your holster pattern too much from what you've drawn. I should also add that if you don't want to make a holster pattern, if you want to get into making holsters but you're afraid you'll make a holster pattern that won't work, it's easy to find holster pattern packs. I know Tandy Leather has several, and they have multiple patterns within the pack for different styles of holsters and many different guns that they'll fit. I personally like the Will Gormley pattern packs. He does a lot of historical recreations. He does one that's of Jesse James money belt and Schofield holsters. I believe he's done a Hand of God from 310 to Yuma pattern pack. Or you can get one of the more generic ones that's just holster patterns. They won't be specifically tailored to your needs like this one that I'm doing right here. But if you're scared that your gun won't fit in your pattern, that is a good option. It's also a good jumping off place, so you can look and see what the patterns look like. You can make a holster. It'll work. And if there's something different that you want to do in the future, then you can start drawing your own patterns. But with all that being said, don't be scared to make your own patterns and build a holster completely from scratch. Like I've said before, if you don't try, you'll never know if you succeed or not. So there you go. That's a holster pattern. So there you have it. We've now made our holster pattern for the holster that we're going to build in this series. I hope this video has been useful to you and you've enjoyed it. If there's anything that I left out that you want to know how I do, leave me a note in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.